It was not in his youth, when the throne was new and the crown still shone like morning light, that the true story of Solomon began to reveal its weight. It was in his final day. An old king sat surrounded by gold that no longer thrilled him, in palaces that no longer impressed him, under a crown that felt heavier than ever before. This was Solomon, the man the world called the wisest who ever lived, the king whom the Lord himself had blessed with unmatched wisdom, staggering wealth, and a kingdom that stretched in glory beyond anything Israel had ever known. He had everything men chase. He held what nations kill for. He possessed what many pray for and never receive. And yet, as the sun moved slowly across the stones of Jerusalem on that last day, something terrifying had settled in his heart. A quiet, crushing emptiness. How does such a story happen? How does a man so favored by God end his life in despair, regret, and spiritual ruin? How does the king who once spoke with the confidence of divine wisdom end by whispering, "Everything is meaningless"? This is not just the story of Solomon's rise. This is the story of his fall. Not just the record of a glorious crown, but of a soul that drifted away from the God who placed that crown on his head. Behind the proverbs, behind the songs, behind the shining temple and rivers of gold, there is a man who slowly, quietly, fatally turned his heart from the Lord. On his last day, Solomon was not simply remembering victories, he was reviewing compromises. Not just counting treasures, he was counting the cost of a divided heart. The wisest king of Israel, the man who once asked only for understanding to judge God's people, now sat in the ruins of his own decisions, feeling the weight of choices that had led him far from the fear of the Lord. And yet, his story is not just about a distant king in an ancient palace. It is about every one of us who has ever battled pride, entertained temptation, or felt the pull of worldly desire dragging us away from the presence of the Most High. If we listen closely to Solomon's final reflections, we will hear more than the sigh of a tired old king. We will hear a warning, a mirror, and a summons. A warning about what happens when the heart drifts. A mirror that shows us our own hidden idols. A summons to return to the God who alone gives meaning to wisdom, success, and life itself. This is the untold story of Solomon's last day. And if we let it, it may change the way we see our own. Long before the old king sat in silence, there was a young man standing in awe. Solomon did not begin his life as a tragic figure. He began as a miracle of grace. He was the son of David and Bathsheba, born into a house marked by both scandal and mercy, chosen by God himself to ascend the throne of Israel after the warrior king laid down his sword. When David's reign drew to a close, the crown did not simply pass by bloodline or politics. It passed by divine appointment. Heaven had chosen Solomon. The kingdom watched as the son of David took his place on the throne, not as a mere successor, but as a promise. Israel's future wrapped in youthful shoulders and an untested heart. It was early in his reign, when the kingdom was still settling under his rule, that something extraordinary happened. Solomon went to Gibeon to sacrifice to the Lord, and there, in the deep of the night, when the fires of the altar had burned low, the Most High drew near. In a dream more real than waking, God appeared and spoke words no human ear easily forgets. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." The universe itself seemed to hold its breath. This was not a wish from a genie or the flattery of men. This was the voice of the living God, offering a blank page to a young king. Solomon could have asked for what most rulers crave: a longer life to enjoy the throne, the death of his enemies to secure his power, overflowing riches to magnify his name. But something in his heart trembled under the weight of responsibility. He looked at the vast nation entrusted to him, the legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he felt small. "I am only a servant," he thought. "How can I lead your great people?" Out of that holy fear came a request that would define his destiny. Not gold, not glory, but an understanding heart. A heart able to discern between good and evil. A mind sharpened not for war, but for justice. The young king asked, in essence, to see as God sees. Heaven was pleased. The request rose like a pure offering, and the Lord answered with more than Solomon had dared to imagine. God granted him wisdom, unparalleled, unmatched, a depth of insight as measureless as the sand on the seashore. But with that wisdom came gifts he had not even sought, riches beyond counting, honor beyond comparison, and the promise of long life, if he would walk in obedience, if he would remain faithful to the commands of the one who had placed him on the throne. In that moment, the path before Solomon was shining and straight. The crown on his head was not just a symbol of power, it was a covenant. His story began not in failure, but in astonishing favor. The question that would haunt his final day had not yet been asked. What would he do with a heart so greatly entrusted by God? It did not take long for the wisdom God had given Solomon to be tested in the raw, painful reality of human life. One day, two women were brought before the throne, ordinary figures in a kingdom of grandeur, yet carrying a tragedy that would echo through history. They stood trembling in the royal court, each claiming to be the mother of the same living child. The air grew heavy as they spoke. Accusations, tears, desperate pleas. There was no witness, no document, no proof. Only a baby crying and two shattered hearts contending for him. The court held its breath. This was not a matter of law alone. It was a matter of life. Then the king spoke words that seemed dreadful, impossible, almost cruel to ears untrained in the ways of divine discernment. "Bring me a sword," Solomon commanded. The blade was brought and gleamed in the light of the throne room. "Cut the living child in two," he said, "and give half to one and half to the other." A chill ran through the room. But Solomon was not seeking blood. He was seeking truth. In the breaking point of horror, the true heart would be revealed. One woman shouted, "No, please, my lord, give her the child. Do not kill him." The other coldly agreed to the division. In that single moment, no argument, no document, no testimony was needed. A mother's love exposed the lie. "Give the living child to the first woman," Solomon decreed. "Do not kill him. She is his mother." And all Israel heard of this judgment and saw that the wisdom of God truly rested on their king. From that day, Solomon's fame did not travel by rumor. It moved like a rising tide. God gave him wisdom and very great insight, a breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore. His wisdom surpassed that of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, each a distilled beam of light cutting through the fog of human foolishness. He wrote over 1,000 songs, melodies carrying themes of life and death, nature and eternity, leadership and faith. His words became rivers where kings and commoners alike came to drink. In time, The ripples of his reputation reached distant lands, until one day a royal caravan approached Jerusalem from the south. The Queen of Sheba, a powerful monarch in her own right, had heard of Solomon's wisdom and the name of the Lord that rested upon him. She came not with flattery, but with hard questions, with riddles that had toppled lesser minds. She walked through his palace, saw his servants, heard his answers, watched his order, his worship, his table, his ascent to the house of the Lord. When she had seen and heard everything, she could no longer contain her astonishment. "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true," she confessed. "But I did not believe it until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me." In that confession, another truth was revealed. Solomon's greatness was never meant to glorify Solomon alone. His wisdom, his order, his prosperity. These were signposts pointing beyond the king to the King of Kings. In the days of his faithfulness, the glory resting on Solomon became a testimony to the God of Israel, so that nations knew there was a Lord whose wisdom outshone all the brilliance of the earth. Before Solomon's failures ever cast a shadow over his story, there was a moment when everything seemed pure, radiant, and aligned with the heart of God. At the center of that moment stood not a palace, not a throne, but a house, a temple. It was the dream David had carried in his heart, the longing of a warrior king who had dwelt in a house of cedar while the ark of God rested in a tent. David was not permitted to build it, but his son was. And so, under Solomon, the desire of one generation became the sacred assignment of the next. The temple in Jerusalem was not just another building in a city of stone. It was crafted as a visible dwelling place of the invisible God, an earthly echo of a heavenly reality. Cedar from the forests of Lebanon was cut and carried. Stones were quarried and shaped so silently that no hammer was heard at the building site. Gold overlaid walls, altars, and inner chambers until the house seemed to glow with its own light. Silver and bronze formed vessels, basins, and fittings. For 7 years, the work continued, with artisans and laborers moving like a single living body under the king's command, until at last the structure stood complete. A masterpiece of sacred architecture rising above Jerusalem. But the true glory of the temple was not in its measurements or materials. It was in what happened the day Solomon gathered all Israel for its dedication. The elders, priests, and leaders assembled. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence and promise, was carried into the most holy place. Sacrifices beyond counting smoked upon the altar. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord, lifted his hands toward heaven, and prayed. His words were not the boasts of a successful king, but the plea of a servant who knew Israel's only hope rested in the mercy of the Lord. That God would hear from heaven when his people sinned and repented, when they were defeated, exiled, broken, or far from home. He asked that this house would be a place where prayers would never go unheard. And heaven answered. As the king finished praying, a cloud of glory descended, thick and overwhelming, filling the temple until the priests could no longer stand to minister. The presence of the Lord took possession of the house built for his name. In that moment, Israel stood at its spiritual peak. Under Solomon's rule, the nation reached heights of wealth, security, and influence no other king would match. Traders, scholars, and rulers from distant lands came not only to see the gold and the order of his court, but to hear the wisdom God had placed in his heart. Israel, for a brief and shining season, became what it was meant to be, a light to the nations, with the temple in Jerusalem as the blazing center of its witness. As the years passed, the promise spoken over Solomon did not remain an invisible blessing. It crystallized into something the world could see, count, and envy. Solomon's reign became a river of wealth flowing through Jerusalem, turning the city into a glittering heart of trade and power. He controlled the arteries of commerce that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, harnessing the caravans and sea routes that carried treasures from faraway lands. Ships left his ports and returned every 3 years, their hulls heavy with gold and silver, ivory and precious wood, apes and peacocks, living emblems of exotic splendor parading through his courts. Scripture tells us that each year Solomon received 666 talents of gold, over 25 tons of it, without even counting the revenue from merchants, traders, and allied kings. The number itself seemed to mock the limits of human accumulation. Gold was no longer a rare wonder. It became the language of daily rule. Shields of pure gold hung in his armories. Goblets of gold lined his tables. Tribute in gold filled his treasuries until even the imagination struggled to grasp its volume. What other kings dreamed of, Solomon handled like common inventory. At the center of this opulence stood his throne, unlike any other seat of power on earth. It was crafted of ivory and overlaid with pure gold, raised on 6 steps that ascended like a staircase of authority. On each side of every step stood lions, 12 in total, silent guardians carved in regal detail, proclaiming strength without a word. No throne in any other kingdom was like it. Visitors would approach and feel their breath catch, not merely at the beauty of the craftsmanship, but at what it represented. A king whose dominion seemed untouchable, whose power appeared unshakable, whose reign looked as though it could never fall. And still, the luxury rolled outward. The palace of the Forest of Lebanon, one of Solomon's great houses, was filled with drinking vessels of pure gold. Every article, every cup, every vessel spoke the same message: abundance without restraint. The chronicler notes, almost with a shock, that in Solomon's days, silver was considered of little value. What other nations cherished and hoarded, Israel treated as common, beneath mention. It was a level of prosperity the world had rarely seen, and it glittered with both promise and danger. For in that gleam lay a subtle shift. Wealth at first had been a gift, sign of God's favor, tool for God's purposes. But as gold multiplied and luxury deepened, the question began to form beneath the surface. Would the king still see his riches as a trust from the Most High? Or would he slowly begin to rest his heart on what he held in his hands, rather than on the God who had given it? The story of Solomon's wealth was breathtaking, but it was also the quiet prelude to a far greater tragedy. The moment when gold began to dull the shine of obedience. But with great wealth came a quieter, deadlier storm. It did not arrive with armies at the gates or enemies on the horizon. It walked into Solomon's life wearing perfume and silk, speaking foreign languages, carrying the banners of distant kingdoms. The king who had once asked only for wisdom began to stretch out his hands towards something else. Alliances, influence, and the admiration of nations bought through marriage. Scripture says that Solomon loved many foreign women: Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, Hittites. Women from nations the Lord had clearly warned Israel about. These were not just marriages of affection. They were treaties sealed in the chambers of the palace. Each union brought political security, but each also carried a spiritual poison. God had said long before, "They will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Yet the warning that should have sounded like thunder faded into a whisper under the music of compromise. The numbers themselves tell the tragedy. 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, 1,000 voices in his courts, 1,000 influences at his table, 1,000 altars waiting to be built in his heart. The very law that had once guarded the throne, "The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray," was now the law the king himself was breaking. And as Solomon grew old, the words of God proved true. His wives turned his heart after other gods. High places began to rise on the hills around Jerusalem, not for the Lord, but for the gods of the nations. Solomon built altars for Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, a deity of sensuality and fertility that mocked the holiness of Israel's God. He raised high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the god of the Ammonites, whose worship included the unthinkable horror of child sacrifice. These were not harmless cultural concessions. They were open defiance of the commands God had given Israel since the days of Moses. The irony was sharp enough to cut stone. The man who had asked for discernment between good and evil now blurred that line with his own hands. The king whose wisdom had once saved a child now sanctioned worship that consumed children in the fire. His heart, once wholly given to the Lord, became divided, fragmented, pulled toward idols by the very loves he had welcomed into his house. David had sinned grievously, yet his heart returned, broken to God. Solomon, with all his wisdom, allowed his heart to drift. The wisest man alive was slowly becoming blind to the one who had made him wise. God's anger toward Solomon did not erupt without warning. It grew like a storm that had been announced long before. The Lord had appeared to Solomon twice, once at Gibeon, once after the dedication of the temple, confirming his covenant, promising blessing, and speaking with unmistakable clarity. "Walk in my ways, keep my commands, and I will establish your throne. But if you turn aside, if you go to serve and worship other gods, then Israel will be cut off from the land, and this house, my dwelling, will become a ruin and a byword among the nations." Those were not the words of a distant deity. They were the pleadings of a covenant-keeping God. Yet, even after hearing the voice of the Lord, even after seeing his glory fill the temple, Solomon continued to build shrines for idols and to bend his life toward the demands of foreign gods. The patience of heaven is long, but it is not endless. At last, Scripture records a chilling verdict. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. The king, who had once been visited by God, was now facing the God who judges kings. Then came the sentence, as precise as it was devastating. "Since this is your attitude," the Lord declared, "and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." The word tear hung heavy in the air. The united kingdom of Israel, built under Saul, strengthened under David, exalted under Solomon, would not remain whole. Sin was not a private matter. A divided heart would lead to a divided kingdom. Yet even in judgment, mercy flickered. For the sake of David, the servant who had loved God despite his failures, the Lord would not bring the full disaster in Solomon's lifetime. The king would die with a crown still on his head, the kingdom formally intact. But the fracture was already forming beneath the surface, like a fault line preparing for an earthquake. The consequences would fall on his son. One day, outside Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials. Ahijah wore a new cloak. Without warning, he took hold of it and tore it into 12 pieces. The sound of ripping fabric echoed the coming tearing of a nation. "Take 10 pieces for yourself," the prophet said. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." In Jeroboam's hands, 10 scraps of cloth fluttered in the wind, symbols of tribes that would one day break away. The judgment was clear. A heart that turned from the Lord would not keep what the Lord had given. Solomon's sin was not erased by his wisdom, nor excused by his success. The Most High had spoken. The crown would remain on his brow for a little while longer, but the kingdom he had adorned with gold was already marked for division. In the end, it was not the noise of celebration that filled Solomon's palace, but the heavy quiet of a man alone with his thoughts. The king who had once dazzled nations now sat surrounded by treasures that no longer stirred his heart. Gold gleamed on the walls. Vessels of pure gold lined the tables. Servants moved with practiced grace. But inside, the wisest man on earth felt a darkness that no lamp could chase away. His body was older, his strength fading. Yet the deepest ache was not in his bones. It was in his soul. This was the Solomon who wrote, "Meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." Those were not the words of a cynical philosopher playing with ideas. They were the confession of a man who had climbed to the top of every tower this world could build and discovered there was nothing there that could hold his heart. He remembered the day he dedicated the temple, when the glory of the Lord descended like a cloud and the priests could not stand to minister. He remembered the fire on the altar, the answered prayers, the certainty that God's presence was the true treasure of Israel. Now, that memory burned him more than it comforted him, because he knew how far his heart had wandered from that holy place. Solomon looked back over a lifetime of pursuits. He had built palaces and gardens, planted vineyards, dug pools, amassed singers, treasures, and servants. He had denied himself nothing his eyes desired, refused his heart no pleasure. Whatever a king could taste, he tasted. Whatever a king could build, he built. And yet, when he surveyed it all, the conclusion crushed him. It was a chasing after the wind. He could feel it slipping through his fingers, even as he tried to cling to it. The laughter, the music, the parties, the projects. They had dazzled for a moment, then dissolved into smoke. The king, who once ruled over overflowing storehouses, now felt impoverished in the only place that mattered. He saw with brutal clarity that wealth without God is emptiness dressed in gold. That pleasure without God is noise over a hollow pit. That achievement without God is a monument to dust. The crown on his head had never been the true measure of his life. The true measure had always been the posture of his heart before the Lord. And as Solomon sat in the twilight of his days, he finally understood. A life that drifts from God, no matter how impressive it appears, ends with an empty crown and a soul that whispers, "Nothing under the sun can satisfy." From that place of painful clarity, Solomon did something that few powerful men ever truly do. He judged himself. The man who had once rendered verdicts for an entire nation now turned the court inward and weighed his own life on the scales of truth. He remembered the wisdom he had written in his youth. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Those words had guided countless others, But he knew now how often he himself had leaned on his own understanding, on alliances, on wealth, on pleasure, on strategies that did not begin with fear of the Lord. Through the ashes of regret, a final blazing conviction emerged. In the closing chapter of Ecclesiastes, Solomon wrote what may be the most important sentence of his life. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. This was not theory, it was testimony. The man who had tasted everything the world could offer was saying, in effect, I have gone to the end of every road under the sun, and only this truth stands. Wisdom without obedience had failed him. Wealth without worship had hollowed him out. Pleasure without reverence had left him starving. In the end, the only ground that did not crumble beneath his feet was the fear of God and obedience to His word. He saw, too, the deeper tragedy of humanity and of his own story. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. Solomon realized he had become the very picture of that verse. A man crafted for uprightness, yet seduced by his own schemes, chasing meaning in everything but the one who gives it. His final words were not the bragging of a successful king, but the warning of a man who had learned too late how high the cost of a divided heart truly is. Solomon's legacy, then, is not just the memory of a wise king, a golden age, or a magnificent temple. It is a sobering mirror held up to every generation. You can start with God, be blessed by God, work for God, and still drift away if your heart ceases to fear Him. It is not how bright your beginning was that will define you. It is who you belong to at the end. The wisest king who ever lived points us not to his throne, but past it, to the throne of the Most High, where true wisdom begins and ends. So his story reaches across centuries and speaks to us now. Do not wait until your final days to discover what matters most. Do not trade a heart devoted to God for the illusions of success, pleasure, or power. Fear God, keep His commandments, walk with Him while you still have breath. For all kingdoms will fall, all crowns will tarnish, all riches will fade. But those who cling to the Lord with an undivided heart will find a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and a king whose glory never ends.